Okay, what we're going to do here is we're going to start by presenting the structured abstract, and it had those particular sections, so we have one section on each of those. And since the structured abstract is little over a column of text in the two-column format, most of the words are in fact on the slides. So you're getting a large percentage of what was actually written in the abstract. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think we need help with. It seems that we didn't make it very clear what we are and are not trying to do. Now this is a little bit unusual paper by a lot of the standards of even computer security papers, so that's perhaps understandable, although we thought we got it fairly clear. Last, we'll talk a little bit about presenting a different flavor of science to an audience with predetermined notions. Now, the discussion session this morning covered a lot of that, but anybody who wants to revisit that in the context of this paper, that's fine. And I should say that my colleague Simon is in the back of the room there, and co-author and PI on the project that funds this work. And so what I'll say is that if you have questions, ask Simon. I'll present the slides and Simon will answer the questions. And that way we'll have a team effort here. You can come up here and sit in front if you want.
You're fine. On the hot seat.
Okay, so the background. Simon has developed a number of tools for computer security analysis and forensics and things of that nature. I've done some of the same. I've been fortunate to do them in a context where there was a customer already predisposed to have them. But even there, I've seen a lot of the analytic techniques I developed using those tools meet a fair amount of resistance, even though to me they seem really simple and obvious. And Carrie is nodding because she's been there. She knows exactly where I talk. But one of the problems is we really didn't understand security operations centers, or I think we had an inkling that the analysts really don't trust researchers to begin with, but this is definitely the case. We've taken a couple of runs at this in the past and looked at some of the published literature in the area, and we believe that the usual tools for listing needs, such as surveys, questionnaires, interviews, and things like that, are largely ineffective in this area. They just don't get at the reasons why things are not happening. Part of the problem is that there is largely a culture of paranoia in many of the operations groups. They don't talk to each other. Why the hell should they talk to some academic researcher from the outside? Many of them are scared that if they tell anybody what they've discovered, it will lead to broader and better attacks. In this very hotel about, oh Lord, it's almost 10 years ago now, CERT ran a workshop for malware analysts that I was privileged to attend as an onlooker of the malware analysts. And it was both sad and hilarious. We offered a forum where everybody was vetted, everybody was from a same community within the larger organization of DoD, and these people didn't want to talk to each other. They didn't want to tell about the techniques they used for pulling apart malware that they found in their networks, for fear that that might lead to somebody figuring out a better way to attack them. And 2 days of workshop produced almost nothing in the way of usable content. Okay? That's an extreme case, but that's an example of what we're in with. The other problem is that a lot of the knowledge that the analysts have is tacit. That is, it's sort of inherent in the culture. They don't even know that they know it. They just act on it. You've seen people who can't explain to you what they're doing, but they do it very well. And this is a real problem, and it turns out that anthropology is real good at making tacit knowledge explicit, and so anthropology seems to be a pretty good idea. Now, meaning that Simon invited me out to Kansas State to give a talk. Raj, who was sponsoring some of his work, was then at HP Labs. came out, the three of us sat down for sort of a brainstorming session, and Raj, I believe, suggested that we use that we try anthropology as a way of getting into this. And so we did that. We wrote a discussion proposal to NSPW, which got encouraging reviews but wasn't accepted. One of the comments was we needed an anthropologist on the team. I mean, we were just rank amateurs at this. So we looked high and low all over the country before we found somebody who was eminently qualified to work with us and who was interested in doing so on the faculty at Kansas State. And so Mike West joined the team, and we've done some interesting things since then. The aim was to try to bridge this chasm between security tool builders and security practitioners. And this applies to commercial tools as well. We see lots of commercial tools installed in operations centers that seem to be there largely as a result of a due diligence mentality on the part of management, not because the analysts really want them. They find them difficult to use, they don't support the workflows that they need to do. They wind up doing a lot of what we call chair swiveling and screen scraping. You take something off of the screen of one display and you type it into the display of another tool so that you have the communications in there. So we had two primary aims. One was to break through this trust barrier so we could figure out what the hell is going on in these places. How do these people work? What do they think? What do they need? What do they want? What would make them more effective? The second was to try to access and make public some of the tacit knowledge that the SOC analysts have. There are two reasons here. The most obvious one is shaping and guiding the development of acceptable tools. The other is providing criteria for helping to train new analysts, for selecting people who might become good analysts, and otherwise figuring out what the culture is so that we can either change it in ways that would be mutually beneficial to everybody or learn how to live with it in ways that will make it more successful as it is. So we use the anthropological method of long-term participant observation as the procedure for the research. The italicized words in here are the things that we were instructed to make sure we had in the structured abstract, and there's no better way than putting the words back in there with enough structure around them so you know we understand what we're doing with them. And so the participant observation procedure puts an observer who has been trained in the anthropological techniques into a society to live with, work with the people in that society, and ultimately you hope to be accepted while still retaining the detached viewpoint of the observer, and thus be able to elicit that tacit knowledge and transcribe it as a contribution to the broader knowledge. In our case, we put our students in there as apprentice analysts into the security operations centers. And some of them served as long as 2 years in that position. Not much progress happens in the first year. It takes a while to break this thing down. This is one of the reasons why questionnaires don't work. I mean, you've got a 30-minute window to talk to somebody who's never seen you before and will never see you again. And if they don't like you, don't trust you, or don't believe in what you're doing, they either aren't going to answer or they're going to put down the answers that turn out to be meaningless. And again, they may not know what they know. That's simply a fundamental point of this kind of anthropological work, is that the people who are part of the community that you are observing don't necessarily know how they knew how to do it that way, or how they learned it. It was just something that was in the culture and they picked up. So what we're trying to do is open up the tacit knowledge of the analysts, who are our research subjects, to the researchers. And in the process, the researchers create a series of field notes, which is essentially the raw data. Now, here is a problem. It is considered unethical in anthropology to share field notes or to publish raw, unedited field notes. And so we cannot ethically, within the prescribes of anthropology, publish our raw data. We can distill it, publish our introspections and conclusions from it, but I'm sorry I can't share that raw data with anybody. The methods that you use for working on that data are largely introspection and reflection. And you try to put yourself in the position of the subject you're observing, and you try to gain enough understanding of what he's doing so that you can understand that and say what's there. This is not a mathematical analysis. It is very subjective. You try to make it as objective as possible through the training that you get and through reflection on why did I believe that about them. Could it be that I don't like that particular aspect of this society and therefore I'm coming up with my own bias against it. The two things we get out of this are insight into the analytic process and the possibility of suggested improvements. The results, interesting. It took Satya almost a year, I think, before he had the breakthrough. I mean, basically what they assigned him doing was the same kind of scut work that junior analysts do in these things. The typical paradigm is, you get a report out of an IDS system or something like that that indicates a problem. You go take the IP addresses, you take the MAC addresses, you try to figure out from the registration data the identity of the machine that's actually doing this, because they use a dynamic IP address assignment system, and so the same IP address may mean a different machine on a different day or at a different time. You then go and do a few more indirect lookups. It takes about 5 minutes to basically identify the machine, mark it for, notify the owner of it, their machine is infected with this particular sort of thing, and go on to the next one. And it's boring. They're all alike. You get umpteen tickets of that kind per day, and your criteria, your metric is how many tickets per day do you process through to finish. So this is not too nice. So I could look at it and said, if we put this stuff we're looking up in all these various tables into a database, we could run the raw data from the alert in, come out with the identity of the machine we need to inform, cross-link that with the registration data and say, okay, that is in such and such a building, room such and such on so-and-so's desk, which is exactly what you need to go send somebody to take action to refresh the machine or run the AV stuff on it or otherwise clean it up, and so on. And that 5 minutes, 2 seconds is pretty nice for one incident type. Well, being able to build that tool was the thing that was the breakthrough and engendered the trust. And at that point, the tool was sort of co-developed by the analyst who was not a programmer, and Satya, who was. And together, they made it work, they demonstrated it, and all of a sudden, similar problems started popping out of the woodwork. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but this may be where we erred in the paper, because the tool really was not the goal of this. Getting the knowledge and gaining the trust of the analyst so we could get the knowledge was the goal. The tool was simply the vehicle that allowed us to go through the barrier and become Satya to become trusted and accepted into the analyst community in that SOC. And people look at it and say, oh, you built a tool, that must be the thing. So that's a possibility as a source for some of the misunderstandings in things. We tried to emphasize that was not it, but I'm thinking this may have been one of the things that was misunderstood. But it started what I call a virtuous cycle. And that is, this tool was a success. Somebody with a similar problem but different inputs and different data that had to be collected came up and said, could you do this one? Somebody else came up with another one. And pretty soon, a large number of the routine analyses were being handled by this particular tool or a derivative from the tool. And several of the things which were most tedious and time-consuming were automated to the point where they were handed off to a lower level SOC, to the actual computer operations group rather than the security group, because it was so easy now for them. They could go do the refreshes on the machine or inform the users they had a problem and things like that. So our real take home here is that we really think that security researchers, especially those who are developing tools that they want to see used, go work with the people who are going to use them. Find out what they actually do. Possibly go visit a wide variety of SOCs. We'll get to that a little bit later. But building a tool in isolation just because you have this wonderful idea of this golly gee whiz approach to identifying a particular intrusion or something like that doesn't necessarily get you something that is going to be useful to the analyst. It's got to fit into the way they work. It's got to be a problem that they're actually confronted with, and that's an issue. In this particular case, the tool was accepted because it fit into the Operations Center's workflow, and it improved its productivity by a lot. But that's because the tool was built with the knowledge of what that workflow was. And so it fit that. It would be really sad if we had built a tool that didn't fit into that workflow. That's not the point. The tool acceptance was the key to engendering trust of the researcher and the co-creation of additional tools. For this SOC, the tool co-creation was the key to breaking the trust barrier and assessing the tacit knowledge. Your mileage may vary. We realize this is one SOC. Since we wrote this paper, we've had people working in 2 other SOCs, and they are somewhat different. And we're getting different conclusions out of them. But in each case, the key has been getting to the point where our researcher could communicate effectively with the people in the work environment, and it takes time. So we thought the abstract was fairly clear, and the rest of the paper supported it. One reviewer accused us of trying to force our tools on the SOC, treating us as tool vendors. Now, last thing I want to do is be a tool vendor. I know too many of them on that. The tools were co-developed by non-programming SOC analysts and our researcher who also happened to be a competent programmer. If he hadn't been a competent programmer, he couldn't have done that. And we probably would have had to find some other way to make this happen. From our standpoint, the tool was incidental. It was not the point. Another thing that's a little disconcerting is that this form here had a box that you checked. Did the research involve human subjects? And I think there was a secondary question under that, and if so, was Institutional Review Board approval obtained? We called the analyst subjects in the abstract, which should be a dead giveaway that there are people involved in this, and it is human subjects research. We explicitly mentioned the IRB approval in the paper, albeit in a footnote, but it was there. And it was very clear, if you read the footnotes, you couldn't have missed it. So the one reviewer who mentioned it didn't spot that we had gotten approval, but he thought maybe we didn't need it because we were all doing this sort of in-house within the institution, which is definitely not the case for IRB approval. You needed even more there on that. So we had some problems in dealing with that. The tool was dismissed as obvious, and we were chastised because we didn't develop something that was a major breakthrough in computer security. Now, I read and reread the call for papers after seeing that because I didn't see any requirement that you had to create a breakthrough in computer security. I thought you had to produce some halfway decent science. And I think by the standards of the anthropological field in which we were trying to work, we followed the procedures that are accepted there. So I'm not sure what we can do to improve the science in this at this point, except having some more practice on it. Anybody who had a bit of programming knowledge and understood the workflow probably could have come up with a similar tool. It turned out it took Satya 2 tries. He tried MySQL for the database the first time around, and it could not ingest the data fast enough. And he finally wound up using a non-SQL database, which had a high data ingestion rate, and everything worked just fine. What he basically did was to cache all the DHCP data for the lifetime of the leases so that he had the relationship between the MAC addresses and the IP addresses available to make that linkage. And that part of the database rolled over every few hours because the leases were generally short-term. There are a lot of laptops in the network that come and go at access points, and they get different IP addresses every time they associate and disassociate. You know, he got it right in building it after the second try, and that's pretty good because that was an experiment and it worked. But participant observation has its goal, breakthroughs of this kind. So at some point you have to be well enough accepted by the community so that people will talk to you as enough of a peer so that you can begin to understand where they're coming from when they do something. Why did they do that? Even if they can't tell you about it, you can eventually figure out what it is they're doing and why. So without the breakthrough, we really couldn't have developed the understanding of the analyst workflow that allowed that tool to be built. And say that the tool turned out to be a hammer. A lot of the routine tasks performed in that particular SOC looked like nails. And you go around and hit it with similar tools, and lots of good things happen. But you know, all is not sunshine and light. Sathya is now interning at another SOC, and the situation there is quite different. We had a summer intern in a third industrial SOC, and it's different in other ways, but that's material for a different paper at a different time. The common factor in all of those is that in all cases we had to have some method of gaining the trust of the people working in the SOC before the analysts could come up with any useful observations. And that's the common point for this kind of research. But the next one is a really interesting case, and it's probably the most interesting finding that's come out today, and it's just really come out in the last week or two. The SOC doesn't have any capability to maintain that tool or to evolve it. Okay? So, to a certain extent, they've stopped using it if the situation changed just a little bit and they needed some slightly different kind of thing. A bespoke tool with its developer present is a boon, but without that support, the custom tool quickly falls into disuse, especially if it breaks or if the conditions change to the point where it's no longer effective. And I don't know an answer there. I mean, we have, Simon just told me that Sathya has just moved within the organization that he's been to a group that is also interested in some tool creation. And in this case, they have the kind of analyst that you'd love to hire. He says, I'm going to go out and learn Python so I can maintain this thing. Now, it's not a high level of programming skill that's required to do this, so he will probably do just fine, and as long as he stays there. Now remember, he's going to be valuable to somebody, and they're going to pay him a lot more to go somewhere else, and this is going to fail in the same way, my wager anyhow, on that. But we've gained some useful knowledge. We're far from a viable solution to the general problem. I think this is one of these things that will take many years and observations in many different kinds of SOCs before we can build a unifying picture that will help us come up with, if not a general solution, one that can be tailored. Then we can go into a place and recognize, oh, this has these kinds of characteristics, this probably is going to work here. But that's the nature of research. You know, you win some, you lose some, and sometimes you break even. Okay, we talked about this in Dr. Deb's keynote and in her keynote, and a little bit detail on it during the discussion session this morning. So it's an open topic for discussion here. We can go back and revisit that and see what sorts of issues in terms of the way science is being done here and the way many of us are accustomed to thinking about science and what we can do about that. And we just had a paper on other aspects of this work that appeared in the September-October issue of Security and Privacy magazine, which is a special issue on incident response centers and operations centers. And so you can find out more information about what we've actually done and sort of the state of where it was early last summer when the first draft of that paper was written in that. So that's basically what I had to present. And I say I can go backwards through these. I think, yes, I can go back them. Yeah, Sammy.
So John, there's a massive amount of tacit knowledge, right, that's possible to attain. One of which, for example, is tracking down false positives, right? And the people who are really, really good at that are 10 times better than the average person at that, right? And so that would be a very valuable class of knowledge. So one of the things I was expecting to hear was, here are the 18 classes of cool implicit knowledge. Here's the one tiny one we went after, workflow, which is interesting, but not as interesting, for example, as discharging false positives, which is a very big problem. And here's how effective that was to gain that implicit knowledge. It took us 2 years. That's a lot of time. Here's how we can make that implicit knowledge knowledge engineering more effective next time. So I didn't kind of get the big picture, of the narrowed hypothesis that you pursued and the implications for getting the really, really valuable tacit knowledge.
Yes.
Okay, let me answer that before we have any more. I have to laugh at that question a little bit. This is the guy who's talking about 10-year funding horizons, right?
Yes.
It took over a year to get to the point where the analysts would actually talk to somebody. Okay, so during that year, we didn't get diddly squat. In the next 6 months or so, we had this breakthrough that we got. But this is a relatively small SOC. The vast majority of the incidents that they handle are, fall into a very small number of categories, quite a few of which we were able to deal with. But, it's I think I can say it's a university SOC, and it's dealing with the kinds of operational programs that you get when you have large numbers of laptops and things like that around on campus. It's not necessarily handling a lot of heavily targeted high-value information, and it doesn't get those kinds of complex incidents that we've been able to see. So it's and I think this is the case in a great many SOCs, that 99% of what they do is very routine stuff. One of the other tools that we developed actually was one that helped track down stolen laptops, which is a substantial problem that they had. If the machine showed up on any of the campus networks, and if it had been registered with the university, we could set up an alert from its MAC address appearing on either one of the authenticated or unauthenticated networks. And that led to the recovery of quite a few machines, because it turns out that most of the thefts of that kind are student on student. And if you stolen one, why did you steal it for? Because you needed one, or you wanted a better one than you had, or whatever. And so those are the kinds of things we hit here. The other SOCs that we're working in, we've had a lot less time in them, only a few months. And we're still in that introductory phase of trying to break through barriers and see. I'm going to guess that even if we put somebody in who was already a highly trained analyst, remember, we're sending somebody who's basically a tier 1 analyst into the beginning of this, he's not going to get those interesting cases even if they're there. And we're also sending somebody who is a graduate student. And the training in anthropology that he gets is somewhat limited. I mean, he is a computer science graduate student, not an anthropology graduate student, which makes him more able to function as an analyst. But your question is a very good one, and I hope by the time this program runs to completion that we will have more answers on these things. But right now we have more questions.
Speaking of more questions, do you have anything quick you want to comment? Okay.
So, John, I'm not familiar with the paper, but it sounds to me like you had two messages in the paper. One of them is that the anthropological technique worked or was effective, and the other one is that a bespoke tool is of its time-limited value. under certain conditions. So,
Yeah, now that's a finding, that second finding, the tool is time-limited value, did not appear until last week. So
well,
it's not in the paper.
okay, so then we can't really speak to that.
Right.
But
Oh, yes, you can.
well, no, because it wasn't in the paper.
I know, but you're supposed to be helping them, right? So,
But-
Yeah, this is an area where, you know, if we redo.
Well, let me finish here, John.
That will appear, so it's fair game.
If I read a paper like what you're describing, what I would find interesting is how can I replicate what you did? If I wanted to take an anthropological approach to something, like maybe getting into a SOC like you described, what are the do's and don'ts that I have to follow, right? What is it that made you successful in your anthropological approach? And what were the pitfalls? What are the things you stumbled over and then had to do a mid-course correction on in order to make this kind of thing successful? This is what I would have wanted to see in such a paper. So like I said, I'm not familiar with the paper, so I don't know if that kind of information was in there or not. I think Frank was actually ahead of me. I cheated on him.
okay, so I didn't see the paper, so I have to ask, as it stands, if the paper is essentially, as you just described it through your abstract, you don't have any data in it, then I would say it's more of a case study. Although even a case study, you'd like to see more data. So I have a couple questions. One of them, and I think you may have answered it. My first question was really about the apprentice that you put in there. How much training did they get on naturalistic or participant observation? Number two, if he was in there for a year or 2 years, I would expect you have a lot of data. And so you mentioned the workflow data. I don't know if the paper included this, but I would have liked to see, tables of data or graphs or charts, similar to what Sandy was saying. Maybe there's other aspects like looking for false alarms. If you go in there, the contribution is partially, a description of the methodology, but I think maybe more appropriate or more useful would be what data and conclusions did you take out of this methodological application in a real SOC? So what kind of data do you have?
We have the raw field notes.
Well, besides do you have any charts or did you do any analysis of the data? Like I said, without that, it's sort of an informal case study.
It is sort of an informal case study. The analysis is basically, there we go, introspection and reflection on the observations of the analyst. I mean, we were not writing down detailed productivity data or documenting the workflows or things like that. That was not the point. The point was to understand what the analysts were trying to do and how they did it.
That is workflow and processes, what you just said. So that doesn't make any sense. That's a completely contradictory statement you just made. That is your analysis, and
Well,
it should have been documented.
it wouldn't have gone into charts and graphs, is what I'm saying.
Text. You can analyze text, qualitative data analysis. If you have data, you haven't done any analysis. I haven't seen anything that's remotely analysis out of what you've just shown. So I didn't read your paper. I'm not one of the reviewers, but I would not have brought it forward either, because you haven't offered anything yet.
Okay, I don't know exactly how to deal with that. As I say, the raw field notes are not fair game to publish, according to what we've got. The conclusions from them are, and that's basically what we have put in. We did have measures on how long it took to carry out these processes by hand and how long it took to carry them out with the tool, and that data is in the paper. But that's just a single number, 5 minutes to 2 seconds. On that. And the process is described in the paper, the lookups that have to be done. It's described as text.
So I think the earlier version of the paper, even maybe this one, we had some sort of diagram, the chart that describes the processing, but I'm not sure if that counts as analysis, because in some sense it's something that we understood after doing the field work. So I'm not sure that's something that you had in mind, it's kind of like some statistics kind of chart kind
Just
of
give you
thing.
some examples. I mean, so I think Sammy covered this kind of, but like how many different tasks did they do? How many times a day did they do that task, the task that
Yeah, we have those.
So, you know, how many analysts, how many times a day? What different tasks did they do? Where were the hang-ups? So those are the kinds of data that you would expect to find in an observational study. I mean, and it's, we're really just...
That won't make up a chart or diagram.
Well,
No,
what-
that's not a good chart.
what I'm talking about is is there any descriptive data that you've reported?
It was in the paper?
I think it should be in the paper, but actually,
So it sounds like there's some,
There's some of that, I'm not sure.
right, okay. So there may be some good thoughts here about getting more of the, not
But
raw
that's
data.
patterns in analyst behavior, right? You observed, yes, that's correct, but like,
Okay.
what patterns did you see? I mean, you were there a year. I mean, there had to be patterns.
I wasn't there, the
Right.
graduate student was there.
But you have all those notes and introspection, reflection, those, you don't give the raw notes, you should be analyzing and summarizing for patterns in those notes.
So I think what can be most helpful is we have some ideas on the types of things to include. So we had, lists of the types of tasks. Are there some other
For
specific?
decision-making processes, styles, interactions, who worked with who, how frequently, why did it take a year to
Okay,
build up trust?
well, one of the things that is interesting is most of these people work in isolation from each other within the SOC, and that is an observation.
You put in the paper.
In the paper, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, these people don't talk to each other, much less to outsiders. And that seems to be part of the culture. So, one guy handles all of the tickets of type X, and if that takes all his available time, that's all he does. If he has slack time, he may handle some other tickets. But it's largely specializing. And this is a very small operation. I believe there are 4 analysts and a director. So for the routine work, the routine work gets handed to the guy who does that particular routine most of the time. And we didn't get involved directly in any of the really rare cases that happen, which are handled by the most senior people, because we had an apprentice in there.
Okay, so let's move on to the next observation or question.
As a former stock analyst and stock manager, I find this very interesting. And like so many others, I have that issue with me ready to read, and I decided to come in here instead. So, one thing is this thing subtitled Cyber Analyst in the Mist or something like that, as you observed. So one of the things that also struck me is you kind of wrote the prime directive. You actually started giving the subjects tools, and you changed the nature of the observations.
Right.
And I guess another question I have is, have you looked at some other anthropological studies to see the similarities between you providing tools in the SOC environment to people from AmeriCorps going out and providing a well or pumping station to someone and then leaving and it breaks down later on?
We've not looked a lot at that part of the literature.
I think that might be an interesting study.
Our anthropologist has been involved in some of those things. He spent some time in a tribe in the jungles in Borneo, which was just becoming acquainted with reading and writing.
And I would say that, SOC can be that way as well. And last, I know that Dartmouth is doing a study on CSERTs for DHS. I don't know if you've had a chance to see their work.
Yes.
But there may be some synergies there in some way to do.
We've looked fairly carefully at that, and it's very interesting because the person who is the PI on that study, his primary study is hierarchical organizations. And he's been trying to find out the hierarchy in SOC organizations, and our observation has been that most of the ones that we are involved in are not in a hierarchy. They are standalone, for the most part. And so I've been a little bit concerned about those papers because they seem to talk about how the theory of hierarchical organizations ought to apply and have no actual experience with finding them in the SOC stuff. So you know, we'll see where that goes. But my gut feeling is it's going off in a direction that may not be terribly useful.
So I think we had a number of really good suggestions in terms of information to provide in the paper and the observations to include. And I think my comment ties into that, and one suggestion I would have is if you can provide that information, that provides a greater meat to the paper, and then you can start to minimize, and depending on how much of the tool description, the tool explanation you have, and this depends on the audience you publish it in, but my guess is you publish it to any major sort of CS conference, people get a little tool crazy, and that's what they're going to focus on, because that's the primary deliverable. But given that extra information, probably one of the biggest helps will be first to really minimize the discussion of the tool. And as you were giving the talk here, you mentioned it's really just a side element of this actual research. So hopefully it can end up being that way in the paper, and sort of mentioned, well, you know, as an aside, oh, we helped them out with this tool, but the main goal of this was providing greater trust among the tribe. So I think that could potentially be a great benefit.
I think that's very helpful. I think one of the reasons why we didn't put the particular information on how they handle incidents in there is that just as I think the tool is not particularly the point, the operations within this particular SOC are not the point that much. If we have experience in a wider range of SOCs than we had one sample when we started working on this paper. And we all knew it was not typical. And until we have a wide enough range so that we can actually do some comparisons between the types of workflows and the types of approaches that work in there, I'm not sure that describing the individual workflows beyond superficially really is much of a utility to the person reading the paper. I mean, I understand the desire for charts, graphs, and numbers, but I don't know what you'll do with those.
So it's not, I would argue it's not so much worrying about the charts, graphs, numbers, sort of from that, but the idea is, like anyone, you know, the anthropologists who will go out and do tribal research, they only have that one tribe. And maybe later in their life, they'll sort of expand out. Mm-hmm. A different tribe you can compare and contrast. But the idea is, as I understand it, I am no anthropologist. I'm only speaking as someone who has friends who are anthropologists. The idea is giving the story of the community, and it's sort of like, you know, sitting there and, although Zach took my monkey reference from me, it's the idea you're sitting there and observing a bunch of apes eating bananas, and how they eat the bananas, trade the bananas, perform incident response on the bananas. That's all sort of interesting information about that tribe, because then when you write it up and you codify it, potentially another anthropologist or STS researcher will go in and do another SOC. And then they're like, well, we saw what happened in this tribe, but this tribe is eating their bananas upside down. What's up with that? So that's where I think it could be useful including that information.
So I'll just piggyback on some of the comments made. So I'm just an engineer and not an anthropologist, but we've done several qualitative studies in my group, but mostly on interviews, and kind of what were said in the audience, that I'm really also surprised that you don't have a lot of data to analyze. So if we interview 20 people for 1 hour on
the qualitative data analysis.
We're not talking about structured interviews. I just gave an example from my own experience. We're doing interviews with which we get data. You have somebody inside for 2 years. You should have data that you can code and analyze.
We should be able to code your notes.
Right.
Not
exactly.
you. I mean, that's the interrelated reliability. It's external people.
So what would be an example of coding and what type of findings?
You're looking for patterns in notes.
So I have a couple of ideas or a couple of thoughts about the discussion that's happening now. So one is, I think it's a little bit of a culture clash in the sense that I don't think anthropology ever said it was a science. And it's being brought to bear like these same standards that we would expect in the scientific, speaking as a scientist, like in the scientific community. So normally, what I'm used to for scientific research, social science research, is you have a developed hypothesis and then you go into the field and it could look like anthropology in these kinds of observational settings and so on. But yes, you are collecting data and you will test a hypothesis. And the idea is someone could then, maybe they can or can't get the field notes or whatever it is, but if they did repeat the experiment, they could compare methods and they can compare all this stuff. So you sort of have this sort of, scientific rubric around it. So I think, that, as far as I can understand, and I did not read the paper either, this seems like sort of a first rough cut at some descriptive analysis, and then that sets the stage for a more comprehensive study. But I don't know. I'm kind of.
I think you have it exactly right. I mean, it is a first rough cut. The fact that it takes a couple of years to do a first rough cut is an indication of the nature of the problem we're seeing.
So I also wanted to mention a couple of other things. So one thing is, I've seen, not so much in this discussion, but in similar discussions, that there is sometimes a sort of confusion around when you do, of course I'm going to mention reproducibility, when you reproduce a study, whether you reproduce the process of the study or whether you're trying to reproduce the findings. And that's something that this discussion kind of reminded me of a little bit, that I just wanted to point out as this community is kind of thinking about how to bring about reproducible methods. And I have seen people try to say, oh, this is reproducible because they've tried every, trick in the book to try and get those particular findings. And I think really the focus is kind of on, can you reproduce those methods, and then you sort of get what you get and take it from there. So it's not a direct comment on this study, but anyway.
But it's a good observation, because in fact we don't expect to get the same results if we try it elsewhere. And say, since we wrote this, we've had people in 2 other SOCs, and we're not seeing the same exact problems that we saw in the one we reported here. And I would have been surprised had we seen them, quite frankly.
Well, you never know if you're going to see the same thing or not. But I think Victoria is right about reproducibility of process.
Yeah.
I think that's important. It goes back to what I said earlier, that what I would have hoped to learn as a reader from a paper like this is what was the process, so that I can try to do this too. But that's not the comment I wanted to make right this second here. I wanted to make a couple of comments. One of them is, this is not the first paper in our field, in computer science, to use an anthropological approach. I think one of the very first papers, I'm sorry I can't remember the author's name, her first name was Lucy. Do you know this person, Deanna?
Yeah.
She did it, Lucy, at Xerox, right? She did
Yeah.
at Xerox.
Yeah, I've actually corresponded with her about some of that work.
Okay, so there are examples there of papers where they took similar approaches, and I guess what I would do is if I was in a position wanting to publish this sort of thing, I would read those papers and I'd say, well, what is it about those papers that in some sense make them publishable? I don't know, right? But maybe there's some lessons that could be drawn there. The second comment I would make, which is something I said to Deanna a little while ago, just privately, a lot of these kinds of methods, not just the anthropological ones, but also the ones that people in the social sciences just take for granted, seem, for some reason, incomprehensible to the computer science and computer security crowd. So in my research methods course, for example, I could easily point the students to any one of maybe a couple of 100 books, right, that have been written about this stuff in other fields. They cannot make the bridge. I don't know why that is. But if I couch it in computer science terms, then it works okay. So what I'm suggesting here is that maybe in your paper, if you can find some way to couch it in computer science terms, which would be a pity in some sense if you have to do that, but to get the message out Maybe that would be one approach.
Yeah. That's a good idea, because, I think it's fairly clear, and the discussion is helping indicate that we have somewhat of a communications problem here.
Well, the the communication is a two-way street, and I think you are in some sense blaming yourself. But, there's the orator on the one side and the listener on the other side. And sometimes the listener is not predisposed to hear the message. So there maybe just has to be some way to open up that person's ears.
So do we have any more? Yes, yeah. No, I was missing somebody.
So, I'm trying to take a step back here. Again, I'm an academic outsider here. I've worked in SOCs, helped build SOCs, managed SOCs. I don't see what you're seeing. And when I build a SOC, there's labor categories, and there are people working in there who do QA and workflow processing. I have scripters in there. It's part of the team. It's part of what they do. My analysts talk to one another. The results of what they do when they build those scripts and those tools, they talk to the security appliance vendors to make those products better. So when I'm saying I'm an academic outsider, this is great research, and it's good you have this talking about science and scientific rigor and all that good stuff that we all need. I would take a step back and ask, why was this even done? What was the underlying purpose of this research, and who funded it, and who got, I think somebody got the wool pulled over their eyes on this one. Whoever paid for 2 years of this analyst to do what I have folks do every day is losing money. I think money would be better spent trying to find that next golden nugget of security appliance or security thing, or the next internet. Something that actually runs the way this was supposed to run in the first place, and it's secure, and it keeps those, from a C&D perspective, it keeps people out of my what's left of my hair. So I don't have to worry about them as much. That's what I need. Not another QA guy who's in there talking to my analysts. My analysts do that. They find a problem, they script it, they do the workflow. So I don't see this as, I don't see the need here as the ultimate user. I don't get it.
Okay, I would like to ask you, where is the published literature on your approach to building a SOC? Because that is badly needed. The SOCs that we have looked at have these problems. And I don't understand why they exist. I don't understand why they have the kinds of people in them that they have, but that seems to be what they can get. And I'd like to know how to avoid that problem.
I'd go back to your, whoever's your CISO or CIO within your university was hiring these folks to begin with and setting this stuff up.
This is not just the university, this is two major corporation SOCs that we've also been looking at. And we're seeing not exactly the same kinds of problems, but the same kinds of people. And the same kinds of low skills.
DOJ, and this is kind of, it's like breathing.
I want to follow up on you. So yeah, and I used to work with the good tech guys there. So one thing that might have also been interesting, actually, this is a rough draft. There is literature about how to develop a SOC, what the workflows are. You might want to talk about how your example differs from what was expected. You might have gone in there with certain expectations of how a SOC might operate, and then you might be able to compare and contrast that. And I agree with you. Yeah, there are so better funded SOCs have people with all those capabilities. But I've also been in situations where exactly what you realize is just 6 guys, and it's barely what you would ever recognize as a SOC.
As I wander over to Laura, I wonder if she's going to say we're out of time.
We're kind of Yeah, I think we need to thank John. It's time to